You have learned about a load of different gender theories, and it's going to be important for you to distinguish between the defining characteristics of each of these theories on the midterm exam. So I highly recommend doing some type of data display where you write down each theory and some key terms that you would associate with each theory. For instance, with symbolic interactionism, roles might be a key term that you associate with that. Psychodynamic theory, you might associate how familial relationships, especially relationships with our parents, affect us in the long term. It's going to be very important for you to be able to tell the difference between these three theories and apply them to different artifacts for the midterm exam. So we're going to close out our discussion of gender theories with one last theory, and that is gender performativity theory. Now, gender performativity theory is rooted in J.L. Austin's speech act theory. So before we understand what Judith Butler talks about or what she means when she talks about gender performativity, we have to go back to basics and understand what performativity means. So performativity is a word that is rooted in speech act theory. And speech act theory deals with linguistics, or the scientific study of language. Linguists believe that language does more than simply describe the world in terms of true or false statements. Like an example of describing the world in a true or false statement would be, the wall in my apartment is white. Well, we can look at that wall and determine whether or not that statement is true or false. Not all statements perform that function, though. Not all statements are what J.L. Austin would describe as constative. They're not necessarily just a reflection of reality or describing something in true or false terms. In fact, different words perform different types of actions, and that's really what's at the heart of speech act theory. So we are going to discuss three different types of speech acts in relation to speech act theory. Those acts are locutionary acts, illocutionary acts, and perlocutionary acts. So you're going to have to be able to tell the difference between these three acts for the midterm. A locutionary speech act is the act of saying something, meaning that speech in and of itself is a performance. So for example, when I describe somebody as talking, I mean that they're performing an action. Talking is a verb. They're putting words together, or to talk is a verb. They're putting words together, they're opening up their mouths, they're, engaging in the physical act of forming sentences, words are coming out of their mouth. Regardless of what they say, they are engaging in the action of saying something. That is what the locutionary act of speech is. But obviously we know that not all statements that come out of a person's mouth are equal or perform the same function. And this brings us to the illocutionary act, which gets at the heart of the speaker's intentions. The illocutionary act are words that suggest rights, commitments, and obligations. In other words, in saying something, we do something. Or another way of putting this is, our speech can actually alter the realities in which we're embedded. For instance, if somebody stands in front of a preacher and says, I take Mary to be my bride, this is more than just a true or false statement. By virtue of this person saying, I take Mary to be my bride, they're altering reality, because this statement connotes an obligation to perform the act of husband, or if gay marriage is legal in the state, perhaps wife. So the action that the sentence described, like promising or naming, as in the case of I take Mary to be my bride, is performed by the utterance itself. So not only is the utterance describing a reality, it's constructing a reality. It's creating a new world. It's actually altering the world in which you live. Illocutionary acts are performative. This is where we're first introduced to the idea of performativity. And what I mean when I say that illocutionary acts are performative is that they create a state of affairs, excuse the typo, by being uttered. So another example. When Mary says, I do, she enters into a legal, socially constructed union, and her life will never again be the same. Mary is a categorically different person after she says, I do, than before she says, I do. Illocutionary speech acts do not merely describe reality, as I said previously, they alter or construct a new reality. In a way that if you said the wall in my living room is white, that doesn't necessarily alter a reality. So you see those two statements just perform completely different functions. Then the perlocutionary speech act is, regardless of what the speaker's intention is, what effect does the utterance have on a reader or listener? The perlocutionary speech act, in other words, emphasizes reader or listener response. So statements may elicit an answer, and this answer may persuade somebody to do something. It may convince them. It could scare them. It could enlighten or inspire them, or it could get somebody to do something or realize something. In other words, a perlocutionary speech act is an act performed by saying something. For instance, if we are on a first date together, or you're on a first date with somebody, we won't make it me because that would just be weird. But if you're on a first date with somebody and the first thing that they say is, wow, I'd really like to marry you. Their intention, their illocutionary speech act may be to show genuine interest in you. But the perlocutionary speech act, or your response, may be frightened. You know, even though the rhetor was not necessarily intending to frighten you, you are scared. You're like, it's kind of a little bit early to be discussing marriage. So again, the perlocutionary speech act is, regardless of what the speaker's intention is, how is it received by the audience? So that is J.L. Austin's speech act theory in a nutshell. So Judith Butler, when she constructs her theories of gender performativity, is interested in how language about gender not only reflects a gendered reality, but it constructs a gender reality. It creates gender roles that we want to play in our culture. Butler is definitely the most prolific scholar on the subject of gender performativity.